In this presentation, I'm going to present the material culture of ancient Egypt in primarily the Bronze Age. And it's a daunting task. This is a very large PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to move quickly through it, partly because the Egyptian civilization left an enormous hundreds of miles along the Nile River of built landscape, and it was astounding to contemporaries in the classical period as much as it is today. So bear in mind that the Nile is surrounded by desert, as we're showing you the Sahara right here, desert mountains to the east and west, and then to the south we have the cataracts, and then to the north there was the Mediterranean. And that life could only exist on the delta, on the river basin of the Nile River itself. The Nile periodically in the summer, fall, would bring down rich alluvium in its flooding process. This flooding coincided with the same season as the hurricane season in America. Those storms brought rain down and would deposit it in a very narrow river valley. Now we're looking from space at the delta of the Nile, and you can see the difference between the rich green of the delta and the desert land where the water doesn't reach. And as you go up the Nile, and we know that the Egyptians basically controlled the Nile for about 600 miles, going south but uphill, the Nile really just begins to develop into just a very narrow band, sometimes as narrow as maybe a mile across, others generally 15, 16 miles across this way. And where the river deposited the alluvium, you get this rich agricultural potential. And where it doesn't, it's the desert. And the Egyptians referred to this as the black earth and the red earth. Again, to the south, there were cataracts, and that kind of controlled movement further south. And the Egyptians learned to basically fortify these, especially the second cataract, with, and protect against raids from sub-Saharan Africa. Just some views again. There we're looking at the pyramids of Giza, the great royal necropolis of the Old Kingdom, 4th Dynasty, and you can see the very distinct line there between the red earth up on the hill where the pyramids are based and the rich agricultural terrain in the river valley itself. And what Herodotus tells us is that it was after the flooding, they would seriate the land, as you see in the illustration, and farmers would go out and sprinkle seed into the mud and have their animals step on it and plod it into the ground. And out of this came grain. And so in prehistoric times, one of our earliest records for the consolidation of Egypt, we have to think of it as we mentioned in the other lecture, a sort of a nearly decomposable state of small principalities known as nomes. And we have the Narmer palette, which dates to about 3100 BC and seems to record the consolidation of these nomes by the pharaoh of Upper Egypt conquering the rest of it and consolidating it. And so it created a tradition in Egypt of long periods of sustained monarchy and complete unification of the Nile Valley, followed by brief periods of collapse and chaos. And here we have just a brief diagram. This is mentioned in the other lecture as well. The Old Kingdom, 2700 to 2200 BC. This is the period of the great godlike pharaohs, followed by the first intermediate period when this broke down. The Middle Kingdom, 2120 to 1780 BC. We know less about this one, but still it was the period in which the pharaohs were powerful. This was followed by the second intermediate period, and in this one we have outside invasions. So we hear about the Hyksos invasions, Semitic peoples that took over the delta and the lower portions of the Nile. And in retaliation to this, we have the New Kingdom. So 1550 to about 1086 or 1069, the last date varies. And this was the period of sort of a retrenchment from the pharaohs from Thebes and Upper Egypt, reconsolidated the Nile, and then pushed outward with armies and conquered the region of Canaan, and vied with the exterior polities such as the Hittites and the Assyrians for domination of the eastern Mediterranean. So New Kingdom, the great imperial era of Egypt. And how do we know this? We have a source from the Hellenistic period, Manetho, the priest who wrote for the Ptolemies, these Macedonian kings, but we also have the great hieroglyphs, and you can see them inscribed on these column drums here. The Egyptians the first to create work with stone architecture, and once they dressed stone surfaces, they recognized that this could be used for recording their records, and so all these temples are just covered with these hieroglyphs. Mostly formulaic, but it does give the names of kings, and from this we have dynasties, and we're able to reconstruct their history more than any other of the Bronze Age civilizations. And one of the important things about it is their burial cults. We have several of these necropolises that have been excavated, and the focus on afterlife. And so we see this mastaba, this burial tomb for Egyptian elites, primarily bureaucrats, to sort of preserve their remains so that they could bask in the glory of the godlike pharaoh after he ascended into the heavens. Another example of the hieroglyphs, last slide was slightly out of place. We have, how do we know about the hieroglyphs? Because of the Rosetta Stone, found by Napoleon's army around 1802, brought to France and translated by Champollion, deciphered. And so this is actually, the stone itself is inscribed in two versions of script of Egyptian script and one version of Hellenistic Greek, and it was from the Greek he was able to translate it. Here on the right, we see the hieroglyphs portraying Cleopatra and her young son Caesarion meeting Marcus Antonius, for example, giving you some sense of the legacy of this style of writing. And an important feature of the cult practices, and we mentioned that Egypt was the most religious of all the peoples of the Mediterranean, with very, very complex, even contradictory sort of cosmology in this way. But we have the Book of the Dead, which was sort of a collection of the various cult hymns for the afterlife, compiled during the Middle Kingdom, that made it possible for Egyptians to obtain afterlife. They had to go through the process of mummification to preserve their remains so that they could gaze upon them as spirits. And then they would have to be judged by the various gods, led by Osiris, the god of the Nile. And we see here Anubis. This is a parchment of the papyrus scroll of the Book of the Dead, and we see the jackal-headed god Anubis weighing the heart of a recently deceased person. It had to have fewer sins or blemishes than a feather in order for the possibility of afterlife. Now, originally, it was just the pharaohs who were the god kings, but increasingly, the religion was democratized so that anybody who could afford the cult practices could expect to obtain the afterlife. And so the pharaohs were believed to be descended directly from Horus, the son of Osiris, and so their spirits had to be preserved in order to protect Egypt. And so we see the development of these mastaba complexes. And think of a mastaba complex as a city devoted to the cult of the dead pharaoh. Each pharaoh, while he was alive, would help to construct his complex for his afterlife. And so here's one of the earliest. This is of the pharaoh Djoser, supposedly designed by his vizier and architect Imhotep in the third dynasty around 2650 BC. And the thing to bear in mind is that each pharaoh would get one of these complexes. And so a land would be allotted to it, just kind of a small city or a village committed to the cult of his memory so that he could be a god and rise in the sky with the sun in the daytime and go into the afterworld in the evening and defeat evil spirits and protect the people of Egypt. And so increasingly over these long periods, more and more pharaohs were taking land out of the control of the reigning pharaoh. And so one wonders whether this didn't lead to some sort of political collapse at the end of the Old Kingdom. The most famous of these is the Great Pyramid of Khufu, pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, approximately 2560 BC. The Great Pyramid stands about 800 feet at the base. It's perfectly rectangular. It rises almost 500 feet. It employs more than 2.3 million granite and limestone blocks in its construction. And then it had this beautiful casement of capping stones limestone, polished limestone to preserve it. And you can see that at the top. In the Middle Kingdom, the remains were plundered extensively by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom to build their great monuments. And so I don't mention them to that degree, but we'll move to the New Kingdom. And this is 1550 to 1077 or 69 BC. And as I said, the New Kingdom was the great imperial era of Egypt, in which the Egyptian armies, led by their warrior pharaohs, went out and conquered exterior terrain, in part because of this need to prevent invasions occurring once again. So here we see the great warrior king Thutmose III, 1475 to 1425 BC, and he's there with a mace in his right arm about to slay a bunch of adversaries that he's got roped up in a net. Down below that we have the cenotaph of his consort, his father's wife, Hatshepsut, the great queen of Egypt. Several queens of Egypt acted as regents. In the case of Hatshepsut, she never gave up power. She reigned for probably about 30 years, commanded armies, explored the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and different features like that. And this mystique of the warrior pharaoh is demonstrated even in this beautiful inlaid ivory casket of the tomb from King Tutankhamun, the son of Akhenaten, of the 18th dynasty. You can see him there in a chariot. He's got a driver, and he's firing arrows at these Nubian warriors down in the at the end of the Egyptian in the south. The chariot warfare became the cutting-edge technology. We mentioned this before, the Marianu. The chariot warriors were in such demand that the Egyptians and the Hittites spent fortunes not only making these machines, but also recruiting the very best warriors. Think of them as the top gun from all over the Mediterranean. So we hear of Mycenaean warriors, for example, serving in both armies at the Battle of Kadesh. The point I'm making here, though, is that the New Kingdom pharaohs were warrior kings in the front, expected to lead and command and exude this militaristic aura. Now their prizes, their tribute, their booty would go into the new imperial cults, the Temple of Amun-Re at Luxor and the other great temple at Karnak. And these temple complexes themselves, very elaborate architectural designs with a series of entryways, giant pylons, forecourts that the people could be welcomed into on festivals, and then closed areas accessible only by the priest, and each one sort of darker, more self-contained, enclosed, and stepping upward at the same time. One of the traditions, the various traditions of creation in Egypt, was the Atum, the god or the rising mound that arose from the primordial waters of Egypt, and the interior inner sanctum of the Egyptian temples sort of replicate this process of the mound rising, the beginning of life. And so in a way, much like the pyramid was supposed to be a launching pad for the pharaoh's spirit to go off into the heavens after he's looked at his remains in the daytime, so the pyramid, the temple complexes were sort of engines, magical engines of strength, magical strength for the Egyptian kingdom. And a lot of booty went to sanctifying and glorifying and edifying these great temple complexes in the New Kingdom. Here are the great pylons at Karnak. And here's just a reconstruction of this inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies there, the icon of the Atum. Another manifestation, very important, of the power of Egypt was its control of trade. Now, we know that the Egyptian pharaohs emphasized they were able to access gold from sub-Saharan Africa, and they exchanged gold as a prestige gift with other kings, the Assyrian kings, the kings in Cyprus, the kings of Canaan, or maybe even the Mycenaeans, as a way of creating sort of a brotherhood of royal kings. We know that they exchanged women as well, members of their families, is to seal diplomatic relationships. And it's kind of a contradiction because at the same time they were expected to fight with each other and kind of defend their perimeter, sort of challenge each other for control of larger regions. But one of the great exports that we see, and again, it's just a container. These are transport amphoras known as Canaanite jars. As you can see, they're about anywhere between 30 to 60 centimeters tall. The reliefs indicate that they carried wine, possibly olive oil as well. So these are transport containers to put on ships and convey overseas. You can see the morphology of it over time. The sort of egg shape with this sort of cylindrical neck and rim at the beginning, but the lug handle kind of designation just below the shoulder, these ear-like handles. Then later they become more canonical, they're more cylindrical, like cone-like, the lower body, still the upright cylindrical neck, kind of a sharp sloping shoulder with an offset to the body, and then you get the lug ear handles once again. And I point out both of these were found in Greece. So these are containers produced in Canaan, probably controlled by Egypt as tribute and distributed out there, maybe as gift giving between the Egyptian pharaoh and foreign kings. But the thing about trade is once you have the infrastructure to engage in this trade, these merchants tend to go into business for themselves as well. So think of the Canaanite jars as a telltale symbol of Egyptian economic power. Other features where we have the great female pharaoh Hatshepsut, 1507 to 1456. She survived her husband Thutmose II. Her son was not of age, her stepson, and so she became the pharaoh. She even dressed like a man. Here we see her portrayed kneeling in with this ceremonial Egyptian beard of a man. She did amazing accomplishments according to her records, and she created this magnificent cenotaph to herself at Deir el-Bahari. And in the walls of it, she records a lineage for herself that was kind of dramatic. She claimed that she was not conceived of by her husband, by her father, but rather Amon-Ra himself came and impregnated her mother, and so she was directly descended from the god Amon-Ra, the great powerful god of imperial New Kingdom Egypt. Thutmose III, the great warrior pharaoh, had to rule with her for quite a while, and then after her death, her records were erased all over the place. Maybe there was some angst about the fact that a female had ruled for so long and impersonated a male pharaoh. Maybe he was just jealous, or his son. One argument said it wasn't him, but rather his son who deleted all of this. Not to say, but what we know is this tendency among New Kingdom pharaohs to sort of toy with the pharaoh's ruler cult. We're back to the point, and we don't have that so much in the earlier pharaohs of the New Kingdom, where they claim to be descended directly from gods, even though the tradition long before, 1,000 years earlier, was of the Osiris cult and the direct descent. And is it possible that now we've got these powerful New Kingdom pharaohs sort of reinventing, recreating an ideology of their rule in this way, and trying to go backwards, really, in terms of a religious ideology? And this becomes most notable about a generation later with the emergence of Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten and forced all of Egypt to adapt to this new quasi-monotheistic cult known as the Aton cult. The Aton was the disk of the sun, the life-giving rays of the sun. And Akhenaten portrayed himself in very ethereal ways. He not as this warrior king at all. No records, representations of him in a chariot fighting. He's always sort of this, what's the word for it? Androgynous figure. He has no muscles, kind of a pot belly, sort of a long face, an aquiline nose. almost like otherworldly figure. This is a bust in the middle. The two busts, the bust on the right is a representation, artistic representation of him based on a bust. On the right, we have another bust of him. In the middle, we have his wife, Nefertiti. And this is the royal family of the 18th dynasty. That is, all the DNA, the mummies were preserved, and the DNA has been tested, and we know who was related to whom in this complex royal family. Here are reliefs from Akhenaten that show the family, Nefertiti and Akhenaten, with their children sitting on their laps, and they're receiving the energy of the life-giving rays of the Aton. He relocated his palace to an empty place. He created an anti-capital, Akhenaten, to be away from the powerful hierarchies, priests and generals at Memphis and at Thebes. He forced everybody, the whole hierarchy, to move with him. He shut down the traditional temples, put all the funding into this new cult, and forced everybody to revere the Aton, or the entire bureaucracy was there with him going along with this. One argument is that he tried to sort of impose the royal family as an intermediary state between the god and the Egyptian people. In other words, you must worship Akhenaten and Nefertiti and the family in order to get close to the Aton. So again, maybe an attempt, a kind of megalomaniacal attempt to impose himself as a religious figure, as a divine figure in Egypt. The whole thing ended terribly. Pestilence hit Egypt. Family members started getting sick. Nefertiti died. His daughters died. Different people died. People took this to mean the gods were unhappy with what he had done. And when he finally passed away, his son Tutankhamun was forced to reopen the temples to kind of appease the public, change his name back to Amon as opposed to the Aton. Nonetheless, when he died, the officers sort of stepped in and took over Egypt and tried to put it back on its militaristic direction. There was some instability there. By this point, things were getting loose in the Mediterranean. There were problems, but we still have an assertion of power at one point with the great builder Ramses II from 1279 to 1203 BC. He was the great pharaoh that fought the Hittite king Mutawalis at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274, kind of creating a standoff between the Hittites and the Egyptians just prior to the beginnings of the collapse of the Bronze Age. Ramses II is generally recognized as the greatest, one of the three greatest builders of all antiquity. He built the big military capital of Pi-Ramses out on the edge of the Sinai, and he built the great temple of Abu Simbel up on the Aswan region of the Nile. The later pharaohs of Egypt of the last century tried to emit an aura that everything's under control. They're defeating these foreign peoples, but it does not seem to have been the case. We start hearing about the sea peoples. They themselves mentioned these people. They knew who these people were, but a migrating horde of maritime peoples that came from the Aegean down the coast of Syria, Palestine, and invaded Egypt repeatedly. Here are the reliefs from Ramses III showing him defeating the sea peoples and reassuring Egypt that things were okay. But this is basically the end of the Bronze Age, and the lights were going out at this point. And we'll discuss this in a later lecture.